Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Arna Sahu, host of Arna's News, where on this podcast channel, I aim to eliminate the gender gap in the STEM fields by featuring inspiring female professionals and highlighting their stories and accomplishments to further encourage girls. Today on episode 58.
And then kind of do that exercise of projecting into the future of like, where do I want to be and what do I need to get there in like a really efficient way, but that is not going to burn me out, because I did go through a period of like 10 or 15 years where I was basically just sleeping 4 hours a night and totally burnt myself out. And then at a certain point, you have to take a step back and then, really cut back. And so either you're going to lose the time by pacing yourself and not killing yourself, you won't get in as many hours, or you can kill yourself and then have to take a break for a while. So, it probably just makes sense to pace oneself. So, figure out what the goals and the milestones are, and then figure out how to pace yourself and get there so that you're not going to be burned out.
Today on episode 58, I'm pleased to announce our guest, Carrie Armel. As a product manager, project director, and an enthusiast in research and development, she is passionate about developing products and programs to benefit society that break new ground. A couple of her groundbreaking projects include $10 million in grants, 25 publications, behavior PhD, and 15 plus years of a mixed methods research in the fields, 5+ years of project management, where she launched several apps, co-founded a 20-project Stanford initiative while mentoring 40 students in the realm of leadership and professional organizations, and worked with Google, Anthem.ai, Pacific Gas and Electric, Nuance, and her domain expertise is in climate and energy, health and wellness, and education. So thank you so much, Carrie, for being here today. Before we dive into the questions, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Carrie Armel. Thanks for the lovely introduction. So I started my career with undergrad and graduate school, focused on psychology with concentrations in cognitive science and neuroscience. And then after I did grad school, I did a postdoc at Stanford, and then and all of that was mostly in cognitive neuroscience. But then I did a second postdoc, or as a research associate, more in applying what I had learned about psychology and cognitive science to trying to address real world issues, specifically in the environmental science domain. So I did that for a little over 10 years. And then I worked at Anthem AI for a while. So that's more in the healthcare industry, but it was also a little bit in that cognitive science domain and mental health issues, cognitive neuroscience. And then more recently, I'm overseeing a user research team at an indie game company that's also focused on mental health issues. So.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for that lovely background. And this is a great segue to my next question, which is, tell us a bit about your career path.
Okay, yeah. So let's see. So all of that sort of laid out the path, but maybe I could talk a little bit more about how I got into it and sort of what the common thread was that was running through it. So when I was probably in 8th grade, we did a Model UN in school, and I was rather shocked. I guess I'd been somewhat sheltered before then, but somewhat shocked at all the different world problems that there were. And every week we would read newspaper clippings about some new issue, like human rights or environmental issues, or domestic abuse, or world hunger. And so I really got to know all these different issues that were going on in a lot more detail. And I found it very disturbing and wanted to help in some way. And so I think that was a real turning point for me, that the rest of my life, I really wanted to be able to do good in the world and contribute. And the common thing that I felt like ran through all of that was that humans were causing these problems. And so if humans were causing them and we could understand what they were doing, what in their psychology, what that was causing them to make these problems, then we might be able to address it. And so that really was the driver for me in trying to understand human behavior. So from there, then I started, with undergrad, grad school, my first postdoc, all three of those really focused on different areas of human behavior and what drove decision making. And I studied various things like, not just psychology or neuroscience or cognitive science, but also non-human primate behavior and, how we're humans similar to non-human primates and what caused non-human primates to do the same things that we do. And then also cross-cultural anthropology, what are the common themes across cultures that you see? Because I kind of felt like if we could get to the core, the root cause through like neuroscience or non-human primates, what do they do the same as us? Or what's common across all cultures? And we could really get down to like the essence of what was causing human behavior. And then we could, play with it and try to like avoid negative things that happen and augment or increase the good things that could happen. So anyhow, so I studied those various things at school and during research and did a lot of research studies, but ultimately I was very disappointed with the impact that academia was having on the real world. So I spent like 10 or more years in academia trying to fix that, trying to like use the brilliant minds that were at Stanford and other places who had done research, but trying to sort of get them to apply things in the real world. And did that to some extent, but it had somewhat limited success because it's an academic institution and these people were really incentivized to produce publications. And, the Stanford's a very good place to transition things out of the university into the real world, but still it was an academic setting. And so I felt like, that was constraining. It didn't get me to where I wanted to go. So then I, worked at Anthem AI, which is much more applied, and the current place that I'm working is also a company more applied. So I made that transition from academia to more applied work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
The
what
industry work.
yeah, like what you were doing, you were trying to solve, the issue in academia of applying technology into the places where you were working in. And that's really great because you were trying to drive an impact. And although, you weren't really allowed to do that with other academia people, you kind of focused your work more on another place where, technology was more applied to give real change to the world. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you.
So, what advice would you give someone wanting to pursue a career similar to yours? And do you have any tips to succeed?
I would say one of the things is, and this is it has to do with work-life balance. But I think it informs how one might go about their career path. So as a woman, I feel like there were things that I really wasn't privy to. People didn't tell me early on. So when when I was going to college and grad school, and as there is now, was like a transition and a heavy push to being very supportive of women, reaching their full potential. And that is fabulous. Like I would not have wanted to live in any other time in history. I feel super privileged to have been a part of that movement. On the other hand, I also wanted to have a family and kids and not burn myself out and become overwhelmed. And so I feel like it not just me, but many people that I know kind of struggled with that balance. It was kind of like, three things. It was like kids, taking care of all the home stuff and economic stuff and doing a job at the same time that really was a career. And it was kind of overwhelming until I made certain adjustments. And two, there's like a timing that women's bodies have that just really is unavoidable. And really, I felt like I wasn't informed until the last possible moment when I was doing my own research. So women basically, their eggs just are between the ages of like 39, 40 to 43, basically just go off a cliff. Like you're fertile and you can have children just fine before that. And basically you go through this transition and like you can't use your own eggs anymore. And fortunately I was able to, and like around 35 I figured things out. But I know many people who didn't, and ended up having to use egg donation or forgo having children, or had fewer children than they wanted to and stuff. So and then the other thing is women also go through another hormonal transition when they're about 50. And so and that comes with like a whole different set of things that nobody really talks about. And there's very good ways of dealing with these issues if one is privy to it, and they can plan ahead and say, oh, I need to do this by this date, and I need to like take these supplements at this other time and stuff. But a lot of it's very like hush hush and unspoken about. And so people can go years before, or it can be too late before they like finally get the full picture. So I feel like, I feel like it's good to kind of put those things out in the open and on the table for women to know about and just plan around, because it's not difficult to plan. It's life is hard in general, and there's lots of hard work and things that people have to do in general. But if you have the knowledge, you can plan around it and you can make it work. And so I think it's good to get that out there so folks can plan around it. So that's kind of on a work-life balance, but you asked more specifically about career advice. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd say career-wise, I think, so this is a tip that someone who's very successful, an old friend of mine, shared recently, which is that he's looked and spoken with friends of his who have been more successful versus less, very smart and successful, but not as successful, and what's the difference between them. And he felt like the difference was that the people who are super successful project manage their lives. And by that, what I mean is they figured out what their goal was, and they set it high, and then they figured out what they needed to do to get there, and they made it happen. And the other set of people who are successful but not as successful basically worked really hard, and they kind of went on a path towards the things that they were interested in, but they were a lot less structured and goal driven. And so, when maybe a promotion passed them by, or they got promoted, but maybe they didn't like build up their skill set and like jump as far as they needed to, then they just ended up not going as far as the other group of folks. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. And if there's a lot of people who don't necessarily know ultimately where they want to go, and so they might say, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. But I guess I'd say, think, either do a hypothetical, run yourself through thought exercises, if like think about the alternatives, and if you don't do that, where are you going to end up? Are you going to be satisfied with that or not satisfied? So maybe create a hypothetical of where you potentially want to end up, and play through the exercise. And if you find yourself at a point along the way where you're like, I'm not where I want to be, then pivot. That's okay. But at least you're still sort of setting your sights high and navigating towards there, because life is short. It's, you think it's long. Everybody thinks it's long. And then you get to be like 40 years old and you're like, life isn't as long as I thought. And then, it keeps going like that. And so you kind of have to make quicker jumps. When people are young, they kind of think they can do anything, and they can pivot and they can go in all different directions. But the older you get, the more doors get closed to you and closed to you. And if you're plodding along at a certain pace, you can't get to the end result, because just you get too old at a certain point. And when you're in your 60s, and like it's hard to find jobs and stuff because people want younger people in and stuff. So your work life is actually, if you're very well established and you really have excelled by the time you're 50 or 60, then you can keep going. But it's hard, like if you're not the expert in your field to do that. And so it's hard to progress past a certain point. So so I think people should kind of think about what would happen if they had a truncated life, like a shorter life, and how can they get there faster, and really come up with like a strategic plan about how they can get there faster. So anyhow, I was long-winded about that. There's one more thing that I would say about my career path specifically, which is and it's hard to do that truncated thing, like to think, oh, my life is, imagine it being shorter. But I think there's potentially ways of doing it, maybe like hanging out with much older people and getting their views. And I also like sometimes play this game with myself where I say, like, oh, like I'll imagine before I know it, I'll be at this point in time. It's like 3 years away. And like before you know it, we're actually at that point in time. I'm like, wow, 3 years went by really fast. And I think if you play that game with yourself a little bit, then you kind of get this realization like, wow, time really does pass by really fast. But the other thing I was going to say for my situation in particular is so I was in academia for a long time, transitioned to industry, and the work I did in academia was related to the impact that I wanted to have in the real world, but there's limited opportunities in academia to make that impact. So I guess I would just, for someone who is specifically interested in, for example, applying the behavioral sciences to environmental issues or climate change, I would say don't spend as much time in academia, like try to make that jump to industry sooner. And because there's kind of a ceiling on how far you can go in academia if you're not a professor. And even if you are a professor, there's kind of only so far you can go. There are professors and non-professors who collaborate with industry and jump back and forth, but it's kind of hard to jump back into academia too much or get too far along once you're in industry. So I think I'd probably encourage people to get the expertise they can in academia quickly and then move on to industry.
Yeah, because like there's like a lot of big things that happen in academia, like because education is always going to change as much as technology is changing. So there's like a lot of jumps that you have to make as, a professor or someone in the teaching subject. So, it's kind of hard to always stay there. So, trying to make that jump. But also I really liked what you said about, work-life balance and keeping things as goals, because when you have this big goal ahead of you, you're climbing a mountain, but the second you're there at that hill, there's another mountain in front of you. So you kind of always have to look at the top and find what you're going to do to try to make it at the summit. But yeah, I really liked what you said about it.
Thank you. Hopefully it's helpful to some people.
Yes. And what is a common myth about your profession that you want to debunk?
So I think for the behavioral sciences and user research, I think people tend to have three gut reactions to it. So one is that it's not, one is that they know the answers already because they're a person and like they have their experience, and that not going to really be told much that they don't already know. And related to that is that user research potentially isn't that important. Like maybe they see it as more academic-y or not like directly related to building the product. And then on the flip side of that, sometimes in policy making, people feel like if the behavioral sciences get applied, that we're like engineering human behavior, and that's dangerous and risky. So I'd say that those are the common myths. And the reality is that you can nudge people, but you can't really engineer. And also that user research and the behavioral sciences can be very useful, but there is a lot of more academic-y stuff in the academic publications, and so I think you need to you need to like find the right information to apply, and not get too lost in the more abstract or like descriptions of what's going on. You need to like hone in on what you can actually apply to change or nudge behavior. And there's a lot out there, but I think it kind of gets lost because a lot of behavioral science, like a lot of programs, undergrad and PhD programs, aren't as focused on the directly applicable stuff. And so a lot of people who get trained out have like a mix, and it's not necessarily as clearly applicable to the real world. But this information is definitely out there. I think it's just bias that's happened because of program training.
Yeah, because a lot of people think that research that you do in like the behavioral sciences, they're not that important. What they are doing is not that good. But the knowledge that you can get from these types of research can be applied to any type of industry or domain. So there's like a lot of room for improvement from this research. So it's not it's not it's not unimportant. It's actually something that's very, very helpful.
Right. Yeah. I think it's tremendous. If done the right way, it's tremendously helpful. I mean, there's, if you think about just apps, there's, if you don't test on users and you don't understand what's, you don't have a mind or training to understand what's really driving their behavior. I mean, how successful are those apps going to be? I think, there's a lot of things that get engineered by engineers and their intuitions, and they end up just kind of going nowhere because they don't resonate with people, because the interfaces are too cumbersome to use. They're not really hitting primary goals that the users have, or pain points that they have. They're not overcoming barriers. There's just tons of things, and if you're not able to really elicit that and study that from your users and figure out how to address all those issues, then it's going to be much less effective than it could be. And that applies not just for apps, but in any sort of programs. There's any interventions through medicine, environmental things, helping people save energy, smoking cessation, drug addiction related stuff, clinical mental health issues. Yeah, I mean, it goes financial savings, so the list goes on and on. It's all very applicable. So yeah.
Absolutely.
And the methods for evaluating them as well. So, there's a lot of ways that people could evaluate and try to understand those things. But if they don't have a certain level of methodological rigor, then they could be drawing the wrong conclusions. So
yeah. And my next question for you is, if you could step into my shoes or a younger self, what would you have asked yourself that I didn't?
So I think I would, in addition to the stuff that we already touched upon with like the women's issues and the career setting, the long-term goals, I think I would so I think what I would do is, there's a great list of values in, I'm trying to remember the author's name. But I would pull up a list of values. Renee starts with a B. I'll look it up while we're talking. But I would look up a list of values, and there's a list of about 100 here. You could probably pull up something similar online. And I would go through the list, and I would pick out your personal top 2 or 3 values, like what really drives you. So for me, after going through that list, mine come up with wanting to make an impact in the world and wanting to do something unique, having a unique contribution. But people have all sorts of values, and family might be a priority value, or it could be patriotism, or religious, whatever, or it could be curiosity, or there's like 100 different values that people have. And be really clear on like what your drivers are for yourself, and then also be clear on just what other objectives do you have in life. Like, do you want to be, when do you love traveling, and when you retire or when you get older, you want to travel, or and maybe throughout your life you want to travel a lot, or do you need a certain lifestyle? I'd be clear on things that would impact like how much money you need to make and how much money you need to save. And I think there's a lot of sense in our society, and I had a lot of sense when I was younger, that really you pick your passion and you just do the best that you can at that passion, and you're going to be totally happy throughout life. And that's really important, right? Because you can't wake up every morning and like be unhappy with what you're doing, but it's not the full picture. It's like you need a certain amount of money for your kids to get good education and to live in a place where they have access to that, or where you're able to send them to private schools if you need to, or you need a certain amount of money that if you want to travel and have a certain lifestyle. I mean, I have a pretty like low-key lifestyle, but I have friends where they feel like they have to do that or they're not refreshed and stuff. And so I'd just be like really clear on what your values are. Like, do you want to have kids, or what do you want your family structure to look like? Is that important to you or not? Like what how much money do you think you need to make, and what your passions are, and like really look at all the pieces, and then kind of do that exercise of projecting into the future of like, where do I want to be and what do I need to get there in like a really, efficient way, but that is not going to burn me out. Because I did go through a period of like 10 or 15 years where I was basically just sleeping 4 hours a night, and totally burnt myself out. And then at a certain point, you have to take a step back and then, really cut back. And so either you're going to lose the time by pacing yourself and not killing yourself, you won't get in as many hours, or you can kill yourself and then have to take a break for a while. So, it probably just makes sense to pace oneself. So, figure out what the goals and the milestones are, and then figure out how to pace yourself and get there so that you're not going to be burned out. So I think planning, all those thought exercises and planning is what I would do if I was in your shoes.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked what you said, because I'm someone who kind of goes in, you go big or go home. And, when something doesn't go out the way I want it to go, then I put in a bunch of time into that. And so just, taking in a break, finding in your values and finding the things that actually make you passionate about what you're doing, that's going to be, your lifelong foundation for success. And that's really just going to help you live a happier life.
Yep. Yeah.
And what are the best resources / books that have helped you find your career path?
Well, I would say the career path, the thread related to what drives human behavior at its core. There's some sort of esoteric books that people might find sort of interesting, but they're not going to be as applied. So I mentioned earlier in the conversation that I was trying to get back to human fundamentals related to, like if we study the brain, or if we study non-human primate behavior, or if we study cross-cultural anthropology, what are kind of like the fundamentals of human behavior, so that we can drive it or change it. And so some of those books are, for example, there's this book called Human Ethology by Eibel Ebbesfeld. He is this German ethologist, and there's this field in the 40s where they would study, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Konrad Lorenz was like the most famous researcher in the field, and he did this duck imprinting study where he took these chicks away from their mother, and the baby chicks imprinted on him, and he walked around and the chicks followed him around, right? And but there was this whole field of ethology of animal behavior and how that works, and it's really intricate. Like people think it's this simple thing, and it's not simple at all. It's like very nuanced and evolved through evolution, and it's not necessarily how you would expect it to be. It's not like a piece of computer software. And so this book, Human Ethology, is trying to take human behavior through that lens, which is really fascinating to like boil it down to those fundamentals and really understand that. So it's a very geeky book, but but I love to just kind of refer to it and have it remind me of those basics. And then there's other, like for neuroscience, there's like Stephen Koslin and Kandel, Jessel, and Schwartz. There's some like basic neuroscience tech. I think Gazaniga also has one where they're just like basic neuroscience textbooks that really goes through everything and has a nice cognitive neuroscience lens to them. And then the cross-cultural, I did the human ethology is kind of like the cross-cultural anthropology stuff. And let's see, animal behavior. There's comparative books on non-human primate behavior. So that I would probably just do a Google search for. So I think those. Oh, and then also, so actually I need to say there's one that's a little bit more applied is Albert Bandura. So Bandura is actually the third most cited psychologist in history. I don't know how well known he is outside of psychology circles, but he basically came up with theories around self-efficacy. And so he really studied like what makes people feel like they're able to do something and take action to do that. And so there's like all these variables that are studied in psychology related to like what are our attitudes and like all sorts of squishier things like that actually are they don't predict behavior very well at all. But self-efficacy has a very high relationship with behavior, and what it focuses on is whether people feel like they're confident that they can do it, which is like a psychological feeling that you can improve people's confidence, but also that they have like they know how to deal with their barriers to doing it, or they can figure out they're confident they can figure out and break away those barriers, whether it's like a social relationship that they have to adjust that relationship or argue with somebody, or it could be a structural barrier, like they don't have a way to get from here to a health clinic, but and so they need help figuring out how to take a bus route or something like that. So there's different barriers, and so Bandura just did a really nice job in investigating that piece, that self-efficacy piece, and how do you increase it in people and really lead them to action. So I think that's a really important theory. But there's a lot of books out there now on like like if folks are going more into artificial intelligence and product management, which is kind of a space that I'm entering. There's some really good books that just came out recently on like language learning models, LLMs, ChatGPT, how they work, product management, Scrum. And so I think if folks do searches on Amazon, they can probably find, like the books that got the most ratings and the highest stars and see what those are. But those are more practical things I'd recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Those books seem really, really interesting, although they might be, in different niches, in neuroscience or in psychology. It's really interesting, and I will definitely take a look at them. But yeah, thank you so much, Carrie, for being here today. We're going to end off the interview because we don't have that much time left. But before we end off, do you have any last words to the audience?
I think we pretty much covered it. I'm really appreciative that you gave me this opportunity. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
And here are my 3 cents on this episode with Carrie. 1. Career path and motivation. Her career path involved working in the domain of cognitive science for a decade. Her motivation was to understand human behavior and find ways to solve problems and enhance positive outcomes for society. She studied various fields such as psychology, neuroscience, non-human primate behavior, and cross-cultural anthropology to get the core of human behavior. 2. Tips for success in a similar career. She emphasizes the importance of work-life balance and structured goal setting for success. Successful individuals in her field project managed their lives, set high goals, and took the necessary steps to achieve them. It's crucial to have a clear understanding of your values and objectives in life and plan accordingly to avoid burnout. And 3, debunking myths and behavioral sciences and research. There are misconceptions about user research and behavioral sciences, such as believing that the answers are already known, or that involving behavioral sciences in policy making is dangerous. Additionally, academic publications can be overwhelming, and it's essential to focus on practical information that can be applied to change behavior effectively. Thus, that concludes the episode for this week. If you want to know more about how I relate to these amazing topics, then stay tuned for upcoming episodes. A free way to support this show is by leaving it a 5-star rating and a review on the player you are listening to. Let me know what you enjoy about this podcast, as it's a chance to tell me what you love about the show, and it helps others discover it too. Once again, thank you for finding me, and I hope we stay in touch with each other. Zito, you're listening to Arna Sahu, the host of Arna's News. Toodles!